A man once called the Mad Cowboy stands at the edge of madness on a dying ranch outside Abilene, haunted by a war that never ended, feared by everyone who knew his name. When the town sends a widow to care for him, they expect her to fail. Or worse. But Lena Whitaker doesn't fear broken men. She walks into silence, decay, and a stranger who won't meet her eyes. What happens next will change them both forever. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came hard across the Texas plain, carrying dust and the smell of dying grass. It swept past the town of Abilene, past the churches and the saloons, past the respectable homes with their white-painted fences, and out into the wild country where the land turned harsh and unforgiving. Out there, miles beyond where decent folk ventured, sat a ranch that had once been proud. Now it was just bones. The fences sagged like old men. The barn leaned so far east it seemed to be trying to run away from something. The main house, you couldn't even call it that anymore, was little more than a cabin, its wood gray and splintered, its windows dark as dead eyes. Weeds choked what had once been a garden. The well stood dry. Even the cattle had mostly wandered off or died, leaving only a handful of skeletal survivors who grazed on nothing and waited for an end that was surely coming. And in the center of all that ruin lived a man the town had given up on. Caleb Rourke. They called him the Mad Cowboy, though never to his face. Not anymore. Not since the incident with Jacob Miller's son, when the boy had snuck onto the property on a dare and Caleb had chased him off with a rifle, screaming words that made no sense, his eyes wild as a rabid dog's. The boy hadn't been hurt, but he'd run all the way back to town without stopping, and when he finally did stop, he couldn't speak for 3 days. After that, people learned to stay away. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do. Some said Caleb had killed a man out there, buried him somewhere on the property. Others claimed he'd gone completely feral, that he ate raw meat and howled at the moon. A few of the older women whispered that he was possessed, that the war had let something dark into him, and now it was eating him from the inside out. The truth, as it often is, was both simpler and more complicated than any of the stories. Caleb Rourke had gone to war in 1898, a young man of 22 with his whole life ahead of him. He'd gone because his father told him to, because it was his duty, because he believed in something bigger than himself. He'd gone with 17 other boys from Abilene and the surrounding ranches, all of them bright-eyed and stupid with patriotism. He'd come back alone. Not alone in body. 3 others had survived, but alone in every way that mattered. Whatever he'd seen in those jungles, whatever he'd done or had done to him, it had carved him hollow. He didn't talk about it. Couldn't, maybe. The few times someone had tried to get him to speak of it, his whole body had started shaking and his eyes had gone distant, looking at something no one else could see. His father had tried, at first. Tried to get him working again, tried to get him talking, tried everything he knew. But Caleb would wake screaming in the night, would drop to the ground at sudden noises, would sometimes go days without speaking a single word. After 6 months, his father died. Some said of a broken heart, others said the strain of trying to reach an unreachable son had simply worn him out. Caleb inherited the ranch and promptly let it fall apart. That was 4 years ago. Now, on a morning in late September, when the heat still pressed down like a hand but the nights were starting to hint at autumn, the town council of Abilene sat in emergency session in the back room of the church, trying to figure out what to do about Caleb Rourke. "Can't just leave him out there," said Thomas Webb, who owned the general store and had a kind heart despite his sharp business sense. "Man's gonna die." "Might be a mercy," muttered Carson Hayes, the banker, a thin man with a thinner soul. "That's a hell of a thing to say," Thomas shot back. "It's a practical thing to say," Carson replied. "He's beyond help. You all know it. The ranch is worthless now, and he's worthless with it. Best thing would be to have him committed to an asylum and sell the land for what little we can get." "He's not insane," said Father Morrison, though his voice lacked conviction. "He's troubled." "Troubled men don't chase children with loaded weapons," Carson said flatly. "The gun wasn't loaded," Thomas pointed out. The boy didn't know that. The argument went in circles for another 20 minutes before someone, Deputy Marshal James Pritchard, a young man still new enough to the job that he thought solutions existed for every problem, made a suggestion that seemed to surprise everyone, including himself. What about a caretaker? The room went quiet. Someone to go out there, James continued, warming to the idea. Look after the place, look after him, just until he gets his feet under him again. Who in their right mind would take that job? Carson asked. I would. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Lena Whitaker stood there, a woman of 38 with dark hair starting to thread with gray, wearing a simple dress that had been mended more than once. Her face was weathered from sun and work, but her eyes were clear and direct. She looked at each man in turn, then settled her gaze on the deputy marshal. I'll do it, she said again. Mrs. Whitaker, Father Morrison began, his voice gentle. That's very generous, but I need the work. She cut him off, not rudely but firmly. Tom's been gone 2 years now. The money he left is almost gone. I've been doing laundry and mending, but it's not enough. If the council is willing to pay for a caretaker, I'm willing to do the caring. The man is dangerous, Carson said. Lena looked at him with something like amusement. So was my husband when he drank. I managed. This is different. Everything's different until you do it, she replied. Then it's just what is. Thomas Webb spoke up. The ranch is in bad shape, Lena. Real bad. And Caleb, he's not right in the head. He might not even let you stay. Then I'll come back and you'll find someone else, she said simply. But I'm willing to try. The men exchanged glances. In truth, they'd been expecting to have to force someone into this job, probably with money they didn't have. The fact that someone was volunteering, even someone as seemingly fragile as a widow woman, was too good to pass up. The council would pay you, Father Morrison said slowly. A small wage, enough for food and supplies. You'd have use of the property while you're there. And if I get him straightened out, Lena asked, then you'll have done a Christian service, the priest replied. I was thinking more along the lines of a bonus, Lena said, and despite themselves, several of the men smiled. We can discuss that if the time comes, Thomas said. But Mrs. Whitaker? Lena, you need to understand what you're getting into. Caleb Rourke isn't just eccentric or difficult. Something broke in him over there in the war. He doesn't talk, barely eats, spends most of his time just sitting, staring at nothing. And when he does move, when he does react, it's violent and unpredictable. You sure you want to walk into that? Lena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. My Tom came back from a different kind of war, she said. The war with himself. The war with the bottle. I know what it looks like when a man's fighting ghosts. And I know that sometimes the only thing that helps is for someone to just be there, not trying to fix them, not trying to make them talk about it, just being there. She straightened her shoulders. When do I start? 2 days later, Lena Whitaker loaded her few possessions into a wagon borrowed from Thomas Webb and set out for the Rourke Ranch. Thomas had offered to drive her, but she'd declined. If she was going to do this, she'd do it on her own terms from the start. The ride took 3 hours. The road, such as it was, wound through increasingly desolate country. The grass here was sparse and yellow, the trees twisted by constant wind. She passed a dead cow once, its ribs showing white through decayed flesh, and further on, the burned-out shell of what might have been a line shack. When she finally saw the ranch in the distance, her first thought was that the men in town hadn't exaggerated. If anything, they'd been kind. The place looked like something from a nightmare. She pulled the wagon to a stop about 50 yards from the cabin and sat for a moment, studying what she could see. The barn was worse up close. She genuinely wasn't sure how it was still standing. The fences were a joke. And the cabin itself. The door hung crooked on its hinges. One of the windows was broken, stuffed with rags. The porch sagged in the middle. Trash and debris littered the yard. Empty bottles, broken tools, what looked like the remains of a chair someone had smashed apart. And sitting on that sagging porch, in the shadow of the overhang, was a figure. A man. Caleb Rourke. Even from this distance, Lena could see he was watching her, not moving, not calling out, just watching. She climbed down from the wagon slowly, deliberately, made no sudden movements, kept her hands visible. She'd learned these things from dealing with her husband in his worst moments, how to approach a dangerous animal without triggering its instincts. "Mr. Rourke," she called out, her voice carrying across the dead yard. "My name is Lena Whitaker. The town council sent me. I'm here to help with the ranch." No response. The figure on the porch might have been a statue. Lena tried again. "I know you didn't ask for help, but I'm asking for work. I need the job, and they tell me you need the help. I'm proposing we need each other." Still nothing. She took a few steps closer. "I'm not here to bother you. I'm not here to fix you or save you or any of that nonsense. I'm here to cook, clean, and do what needs doing around the place. You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to like me. You just have to let me work." The figure shifted slightly. Lena froze, but he wasn't standing, just adjusting his position, like someone who'd been sitting too long. She could see him better now. He was tall, or had been before whatever weight he carried had bent him. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard wild. His clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in months. But it was his eyes that struck her most. Even from this distance, she could feel them on her, dark and wary and utterly without hope. "I'm going to start unloading my wagon now," she said, keeping her voice level and calm. "I'll be staying in the cabin. If you want to leave, that's fine. If you want to stay, that's fine too. I'm not going to chase you off your own property." She turned her back on him then, a calculated risk, and walked back to the wagon. Started pulling out her bags and supplies, a sack of flour, some cured meat, her own meager collection of cookware and linens. The rifle Thomas had insisted she take, which she kept covered with a blanket and didn't make a show of. She made 3 trips to and from the wagon, carrying her things to the porch and setting them down. Each time she passed the man sitting there, she didn't look directly at him, didn't speak to him, just acknowledged his presence the way you might acknowledge a tree or a rock, something that existed, that had a right to exist but required no special treatment. On her 4th trip, as she was carrying a heavy bag of cornmeal, she stumbled slightly on the broken porch step. The bag started to slip. A hand shot out and caught it. Lena looked up, startled. Caleb Rourke was standing now, much closer than she'd realized he could move. He was even taller than she'd thought, well over 6 feet. And despite his gauntness, she could see the remnants of considerable strength in his frame. This close, she could see his eyes clearly. They were gray, the color of smoke or storm clouds, and they were looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not friendly either, wary, confused maybe, like he couldn't quite figure out what she was doing here. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking back the bag now that she had her balance. He let go immediately and stepped back, almost stumbling in his haste to put distance between them. Lena pretended not to notice. "Last load," she said, more to herself than to him, and went back to the wagon. When she returned with the final armload, blankets and a pillow, he was gone. She looked around but saw no sign of him. The yard was empty. The barn doors hung open, but she couldn't see into the darkness inside. He'd vanished like smoke. Lena stood there for a moment, then shrugged and pushed open the cabin door. The smell hit her first, decay and neglect and unwashed human. She had to breathe through her mouth for the first few minutes. The single room was chaos, a mess of discarded clothes, empty bottles, plates crusted with God knew what. The fireplace was choked with old ash. The furniture that remained, a table, 1 chair, a bed frame without bedding, was thick with dust and grime. She set down her things and rolled up her sleeves. By the time the sun began to set, she'd made a dent. Not a big one, but a dent. She'd swept the floor, cleared the table, washed the dishes she could salvage, and thrown out the ones she couldn't. She'd opened the unbroken window to air the place out, made up the bed with her own linens, got a small fire going in the cleaned-out fireplace. She cooked a simple meal, beans and cornbread, and set 2 plates on the now-clean table. Then she sat down and waited. He didn't come. She ate alone, washed the dishes, and as true night fell, she lay down on the bed fully clothed, the rifle within reach, and tried to sleep. She woke to sounds in the darkness. Footsteps, light and careful. The creak of a floorboard. Her hand found the rifle, but she didn't move otherwise, keeping her breathing steady and even, feigning sleep. Through barely opened eyes, she watched a shadow move through the room. It went to the table where she'd left the second plate of food. Paused there. Then there were the soft sounds of someone eating. Not with utensils, she realized, but with their hands, quick and furtive like an animal afraid of being caught. When the food was gone, the shadow moved to the door and slipped out into the night. Lena lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, she woke before dawn and started again. She made breakfast, more cornbread, some eggs she'd brought from town, and left a plate on the table. Then she went outside to assess the damage. It was worse in daylight, if that was possible. The well was dry, which meant she'd have to haul water from the creek she'd passed about a quarter-mile back. The chicken coop was empty except for the skeletal remains of birds that had died trapped inside. The vegetable garden was a graveyard of dead plants and choking weeds. She started with what she could manage, drew water from the creek, hauled it back in buckets, filled the containers she'd brought, started clearing the worst of the debris from the yard, found a hammer and some nails in the barn, which was a terrifying place full of shadows and strange sounds, and did what she could to repair the porch step. She didn't see Caleb all day, but she felt him watching, caught glimpses of movement in the barn, or heard sounds from inside the cabin when she was outside. He was there, somewhere, observing. That night, she cooked again, left a plate, went to bed. Again, he came in the darkness, ate, left. This pattern continued for a week. Lena worked from dawn to dusk, slowly pushing back against years of neglect. She hauled water, cleared weeds, patched what could be patched. She cooked 3 meals a day and left portions for the ghost that haunted this place. And Caleb watched from the shadows, never speaking, never approaching except to take the food she left. On the 8th day, something changed. Lena was struggling with a section of fence that had collapsed completely. The posts were rotted, the wire a tangled mess. She'd been trying to pull it free for the better part of an hour, but it was caught on something and wouldn't budge. She was sweating, frustrated, about ready to give up when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Caleb stood about 10 feet away, looking at the fence. Not at her. At the fence. They stood like that for a long moment, neither speaking. Then he moved forward, still not looking at her, and grabbed the section of wire she'd been fighting with. One hard yank, and it came free, the hidden snag, a piece of old root, breaking loose. He dropped the wire and stepped back immediately like he'd done something wrong. "Thank you," Lena said. He didn't respond, didn't look at her, just stood there, staring at the ground. Lena turned back to the fence. "I'm going to need new posts," she said, talking to the air. "These ones are rotted through. Probably need about a dozen to fix this section properly." Silence. She didn't push, just kept working, coiling the freed wire, clearing away the worst of the debris. After a few minutes, she heard him walk away. But the next morning, when she went out to continue working on the fence, she found 12 newly cut posts stacked neatly beside the break. They were rough, but serviceable, still smelling of fresh wood. She looked around but saw no sign of him. "Thank you," she said to the empty air, and got to work. That became their new pattern. She would work on something, struggle with something, and he would help, but only when she wasn't directly asking for it, only when he could maintain the pretense that he was doing it of his own accord, not because she needed him. She'd find tools she couldn't reach mysteriously placed within reach. Heavy things she'd been planning to move would be moved overnight. Once, when she was trying to rehang the cabin door properly and couldn't manage the weight alone, he appeared from nowhere, held it in place while she worked, then vanished again the moment it was secure. They still didn't speak, but they were communicating. The ranch slowly, grudgingly began to come back to life. The worst of the debris was cleared. The fence, at least some of it, was repaired. The garden was cleared and turned ready for planting come spring. Lena even got a few chickens from town, and to her surprise, they actually lived. 3 weeks after her arrival, on a cool October morning, Lena was grinding corn for meal when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up to see 3 riders coming down the path toward the ranch. She didn't recognize them, but something about the way they sat their horses, the way they looked at the place, set her teeth on edge. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet them, putting herself between the riders and the cabin. The men pulled up about 20 feet away. They were young, probably in their mid-20s, wearing clothes that marked them as ranch hands or drifters. The one in the middle, a sandy-haired man with a mean smile, looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," he said, "so the rumors are true. They actually found someone crazy enough to come out here." "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Lena asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Gentlemen," one of the others laughed. "Hear that, Wyatt? She called us gentlemen." The sandy-haired one, Wyatt, grinned. We're just passing through, ma'am. Thought we'd stop and see if old crazy Caleb was still alive. Mr. Rourke is fine, Lena said, and this is private property. Oh, we know whose property it is, Wyatt said. We worked for his daddy back before Caleb went off to war and came back touched in the head. Ain't that right, boys? That's right, the third rider said. Used to be a fine ranch. Now look at it. Pathetic. I think it's time for you to leave, Lena said, her voice hardening. We'll leave when we're ready, Wyatt replied. His smile faded. We want to see Caleb. Have a word with him. That's not going to happen. You think you can stop us, woman? Lena didn't answer immediately. She was calculating distances, odds, wondering if she could get back to the cabin and the rifle before they could reach her. Probably not. I think, she said carefully, that you're trespassing, and I'm asking you nicely to leave. If you don't, I'll have to ask not so nicely. Wyatt laughed outright at that. You hear this? The widow woman's threatening us. He leaned forward in his saddle. Here's what's going to happen, sweetheart. We're going to have a little fun. Maybe rough up old Caleb a bit. Remind him what happens when... He never finished the sentence. A rifle shot cracked across the yard, kicking up dust 2 feet in front of Wyatt's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. Lena spun around. Caleb stood on the cabin porch, rifle to his shoulder, already working the lever for another round. His face was white, his hands shaking, but the rifle was steady. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Wyatt got his horse under control, and his face twisted with fury. You crazy son of a... Another shot, closer this time, right between his horse's front hooves. The animal screamed and backed up hard. Get off my land, Caleb said. His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a croak, but it carried. You're going to pay for that, Wyatt snarled. But he was already turning his horse. The other two followed suit, throwing looks over their shoulders that promised this wasn't over. They rode off at a gallop, dust rising in their wake. Lena turned back to Caleb. He was still on the porch, but the rifle was lowering. His whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving something worse in its wake. She watched as he stumbled backward, sat down hard on the porch step. The rifle fell from his hands. His breathing was coming fast and shallow, his eyes wide and fixed on something that wasn't there. Lena approached slowly. Caleb? No response. He was somewhere else now, seeing something else. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. She sat down on the step beside him, not touching, just present. You did good, she said quietly. They're gone. We're safe. His breathing didn't slow. If anything, it got worse. His hands clutched at his knees, knuckles white. Lena did the only thing she could think of. She started talking, nothing important, just talking about the weather, about the chickens, about how she'd need to get more cornmeal from town soon, about the fence post that was still giving her trouble on the south side. She talked until her voice went hoarse, and slowly, so slowly, his breathing began to even out. The terrible distance in his eyes started to recede. When he finally seemed to come back to himself, he looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd arrived. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? For this. For being. He gestured vaguely at himself, the ranch, everything. For all of it. Nothing to be sorry for, Lena said. You defended your home. Our home, she corrected herself. That's nothing to apologize for. He shook his head. You don't understand. I can't control it. When things happen, when there's noise or people trying to hurt. He stopped, struggling. I go away, back there, and I can't stop it. I know, Lena said gently. You should leave, he said, before something happens. Before I... No. He looked at her, confused. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. We had a deal. I work, you let me work. That deal stands. Those men were in the wrong, not you. And if they come back, we'll deal with it together. Together, he repeated like the word was foreign. Together, she confirmed. He was quiet for a long time, then so softly she almost missed it. Thank you. You're welcome. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, two broken people in a broken place. And for the first time in a very long time, Neither of them felt quite so alone. That night, when Lena set out dinner, Caleb didn't wait for darkness. He sat down at the table across from her, and they ate together in silence. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed found their own rhythm, like water finding its course after a long drought. Caleb still didn't speak much. Some mornings he'd manage a nod, others just a flicker of acknowledgement in those storm-gray eyes. But he was present now in a way he hadn't been before. He ate at the table instead of in the shadows. He worked alongside Lena instead of vanishing at her approach. The silence between them became something shared rather than something endured. Lena learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. The set of his shoulders told her if he'd slept or spent the night pacing. The tightness around his eyes warned her when the memories were pressing close. On bad days, she gave him space. On better days, they worked side by side, communicating through gesture and action rather than words. It was on one of those better days, nearly a month after her arrival, that they tackled the barn together. The structure was a disaster waiting to happen. The eastern wall had shifted so far off its foundation that Lena was genuinely shocked a strong wind hadn't flattened the whole thing. They needed to brace it, shore it up with new support beams before winter came in earnest. Caleb had the height and strength to position the beams, but Lena had to guide them, hold them steady while he worked. It required them to coordinate, to anticipate each other's movements. At first it was awkward, full of false starts and near misses, but gradually they found a synchronization, a kind of wordless dance. "Left," Lena called out as Caleb hoisted a heavy timber. "A bit more. There." He shifted, muscles straining under his worn shirt, and wedged the beam into place. Lena scrambled up beside him with a handful of nails and the hammer, and together they secured it. When they finally stepped back to survey their work, Lena wiped sweat from her forehead and allowed herself a small smile. The barn still looked like hell, but it looked like hell that wouldn't collapse in the next storm. "Not bad," she said. Caleb made a sound that might have been agreement. Then, surprising her, "You're good at this." She looked at him. He was staring at the barn, not at her, but there was something in his voice, not quite warmth, but not the usual flatness either. "My father was a carpenter," she said, "before he drank himself to death. He taught me some things when he was sober enough to hold a hammer straight." Caleb nodded slowly. After a moment, "My father built this barn. Took him 2 summers. He was so proud of it." It was the most he'd said about his past since she'd arrived. Lena didn't push, just listened. "Used to be full of horses," Caleb continued, his voice distant. "Good stock. He had an eye for bloodlines, knew which mares to breed to which stallions. People came from 3 counties over to buy his horses. What happened to them?" "Sold most of them before the war. The rest," he trailed off. "The rest died while I was gone, or got stolen. When I came back, there was nothing left, just bones and emptiness." Lena heard the weight in those words, the guilt. "That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it?" He finally looked at her, and the rawness in his expression made her chest tight. "I left. I chose to go. And when I came back, I was too broken to hold on to what he'd built. I let it all fall apart. This barn, the horses, the ranch, all of it. He worked his whole life building something, and I destroyed it in 4 years." "You didn't destroy anything," Lena said firmly. "You survived. That's what you did. You survived when others didn't, and then you had to keep surviving when maybe part of you didn't want to. That's not destruction. That's just what it is." He shook his head. "You don't understand." "No," she agreed. "I don't understand what you went through over there. I'll never understand that. But I understand what it's like to watch something fall apart and feel like it's your fault. I understand what it's like to be so tired you can't see straight, but you still have to keep going because stopping means dying." She gestured at the barn, the ranch around them. "This place isn't destroyed, it's just wounded. And wounded things can heal if you give them time and care." "And if they can't?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What if they're too far gone?" Lena met his eyes. "Then you try anyway, because the trying matters more than the outcome." They stood in the shadow of the barn as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, and something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition. 2 people who'd been hollowed out by life, trying to figure out how to be full again. The work continued. November arrived with cold mornings and the first threat of frost. Lena planted what could still be planted before winter: garlic, some hardy greens. She convinced Caleb to help her reinforce the chicken coop against predators, and together they built nesting boxes from scrap wood. The 6 chickens she'd brought from town had somehow become 9, though she had no idea where the extra 3 had come from. When she mentioned it to Caleb, he'd just shrugged, but she could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile. He was sleeping better, she thought, or at least sleeping differently. She still heard him wake sometimes in the night, heard the sharp intake of breath that meant he'd dragged himself out of some nightmare, but he didn't pace as much, didn't stand at the window for hours staring at nothing. They settled into an easy coexistence. Mornings began with Lena making coffee while Caleb checked on the handful of cattle that had wandered back to the property, drawn by the fresh water and the repaired fences. Midday they'd work together on whatever the ranch demanded: fixing, building, salvaging. Evenings they spent in the cabin, Lena mending clothes or planning the next day's work, while Caleb sat by the fire, sometimes whittling, sometimes just watching the flames. It was during one of those quiet evenings that he asked her about her husband. Thomas Webb said he died 2 years ago. Lena didn't look up from the shirt she was mending. That's right. How? She threaded her needle carefully before answering. He was drinking, tried to ford the creek when it was running high after a storm. Horse got swept away. Tom did too. I'm sorry. So was I, she said, and angry. Angry that he'd been drinking again after promising he wouldn't. Angry that he'd been so stupid. Angry that he left me alone. She tied off the thread and bit it clean. Anger doesn't bring people back, though. No, Caleb agreed quietly. It doesn't. But neither does guilt, she added, looking at him now. And that's something you need to learn. He didn't respond to that, just turned his attention back to the piece of wood he was working on. But she could see she'd struck something true. December brought the first real snow. Not much, just a few inches that melted by afternoon, but enough to remind them that winter was coming in earnest, and they weren't ready. The cabin needed proper chinking against the cold. The roof had holes that would leak when the snow piled up, and they were low on firewood. They spent 3 days cutting and splitting wood, building up a supply that would see them through the worst of it. Caleb worked with a kind of focused intensity, like he was trying to outrun something. Lena let him set the pace, matching his rhythm when she could, taking breaks when her arms gave out while he kept going. On the 3rd day, as the sun was setting and they were stacking the last of the split logs, she noticed him favoring his left hand. "Let me see that," she said. It's nothing." "Let me see it anyway." He hesitated, then held out his hand. His palm was blistered and bleeding, the skin torn open in several places from the axe handle. "This is not nothing," Lena said. "Come on." She led him back to the cabin and made him sit while she cleaned and bandaged the wounds. His hands were shaking again, not from pain, she realized, but from proximity. He wasn't used to being touched, to having someone care for him. "You need to tell me when something hurts," she said as she worked. "Pride's not worth infection." "Wasn't pride," he murmured. "Just forgot it mattered." She looked up at him. "It matters." When his hands were wrapped, she made him keep them elevated while she cooked dinner. He protested weakly, said he could manage, but she ignored him. They ate together, and afterward, when she was washing the dishes, he spoke from his seat by the fire. "Why are you really here, Lena?" She paused, hands in the soapy water. "I told you, I needed work." "There's easier work than this." "Maybe. So why?" She dried her hands and turned to face him. "You want the truth?" "I'd appreciate it." She sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. "When Tom died, I thought about dying too. Not doing anything about it, not really, but just giving up, letting myself fade. I was so tired of fighting, tired of being alone, tired of waking up every day to nothing but memories and regrets." Caleb watched her, his expression unreadable. "Then the council offered me this job," she continued. "And at first I thought it was just money, just survival. But when I got here and saw this place, saw you, I don't know, something in me recognized something in you. And I thought maybe if I could help put this place back together, maybe I could put myself back together too." "And have you?" he asked quietly. She smiled, but it was sad. "Some days, Other days I'm still just tired, but at least now I'm tired for a reason. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Then Caleb spoke, his voice rough. I don't know how to be a person anymore. The admission hung in the air, stark and painful. I wake up and I don't know where I am, he continued. I hear things that aren't there, see things that aren't real. Sometimes I'm back in the jungle and I can't find my way out. And even on the good days when I'm mostly here, I feel like I'm made of glass, like one wrong move and I'll shatter. Then don't make wrong moves, Lena said simply. Make right ones, one at a time. You don't have to fix everything at once, Caleb. You just have to get through today. Then tomorrow, you get through tomorrow. What if I can't? Then I'll help you. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his face cracked open, not breaking, opening, like a door that had been locked too long finally giving way. Why? He whispered. Because nobody should have to be alone in the dark, she said. And because despite what you think, you're not made of glass. You're made of whatever survives fire, and that's stronger than you know. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Lena woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the windowsill. Bad night? She asked. He nodded without turning around. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went to stand beside him. Outside, the world was silver with frost, everything crystallized and still. Tell me about one good thing, she said. From before the war, just one thing that was good. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, there was a horse, a gray mare named Silver, stupid name I know, but I was 12 and thought I was clever. She was wild when we got her, wouldn't let anyone near. My father said to leave her be, that some things couldn't be tamed. But I spent every day that summer just sitting in her pen, not trying to touch her, not trying to ride her, just being there. What happened? One day she walked up to me, just like that, put her nose against my hand. After that, she followed me everywhere, ate from my hand, let me groom her, eventually let me ride her. My father couldn't believe it. Lena could hear the smile in his voice, faint but real. She was the best horse we ever had, Caleb continued. Smart, fast, gentle. I rode her until I left for the war. When I came back, he stopped. She was gone? Yeah. Someone told me she'd gotten sick the winter I was away. They had to put her down. He swallowed hard. Sounds stupid, but that hurt worse than a lot of other things. She was just a horse, but she was good, you know? I know, Lena said softly. Good things staying good, that's rare. Worth remembering. They stood together watching the sunrise paint the frost-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed a little lighter. But peace, Lena was learning, was a fragile thing. It was a week before Christmas when the riders came back. Lena was in the barn, tending to one of the cows that had shown up with a limp. She heard the horses before she saw them, 3 riders again, but she knew without looking that one of them would be Wyatt. She stepped out of the barn to find Caleb already on the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. The riders pulled up in the yard, closer than last time, bold with numbers. Wyatt had brought friends, not the same 2 as before. These men were harder looking, older, with the kind of eyes that said they'd done things they weren't proud of and didn't much care. Well, well, Wyatt said, grinning that mean grin. If it ain't the happy couple. How's domestic life treating you, crazy Caleb? Get off my land, Caleb said. His voice was steady, but Lena could see the tremor starting in his hands. See, that's the thing, Wyatt replied. This ain't really your land anymore, is it? You haven't paid taxes in 2 years, bank's about ready to foreclose. So technically, this is land that's about to belong to whoever can afford to buy it. And I happen to know some people with money. Lena felt her stomach drop. She didn't know if he was telling the truth, but it had the ring of it. That's not your concern, she said, stepping forward. Oh, but it is, sweetheart, Wyatt said. See, my employer is interested in this property. Good water rights, decent grazing. Once we clear away the trash, it'll be worth something. Who's your employer? Lena demanded. Carson Hayes, one of the other riders said, and Lena's blood went cold. The banker, The man who'd wanted Caleb committed and the land sold. Of course. Mister, Hayes can take his offer to hell, Lena said. Wyatt laughed. Tough talk from a widow woman playing house with a lunatic. He leaned forward in his saddle, his expression hardening. Here's how this is going to work. You two are going to pack up and clear out, nice and peaceful. Nobody gets hurt. Come spring, this land goes on the market and my boss makes a fair purchase. And if we don't? Caleb's voice was tight. Then things get unpleasant. Wyatt gestured to his companions. These boys here, they're not as patient as I am. They think maybe we should just burn you out, save everyone the trouble. Lena saw Caleb's hand tighten on the rifle, saw the way his breathing was starting to quicken. He was losing his grip, falling back into that dark place where the present and the past blurred together. She moved before she could think it through, stepping directly in front of Caleb, putting herself between him and the riders, between him and the threat that was pulling him under. You need to leave, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Right now. This is your last warning. Wyatt's smile faded. Or what? The crazy man's going to shoot us? We'll see him hang for murder. No, Lena said. I'm going to ride into town and tell Deputy Marshal Pritchard that Carson Hayes is sending men to threaten us off our legal property. I'm going to tell him you threatened arson, and I'm going to make sure everyone in Abilene knows that the respectable banker is trying to steal land from a war veteran. Nobody'll believe you. You sure about that? Lena smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Because I may be just a widow woman, but I've lived in this town my whole life. I know everyone. I wash their clothes, mend their tears, hear their confessions over tea. You think they'll take your word over mine? She saw uncertainty flicker across Wyatt's face. And even if they do, she continued, even if they don't believe me, they'll have to investigate. They'll have to ask questions. Carson Hayes might own the bank, but he doesn't own the law. Not yet, anyway. You willing to bet your job on it? The standoff stretched out, taut as wire. Then one of the other riders shifted uncomfortably. Come on, Wyatt. This ain't worth it. Shut up, Wyatt snapped, but his eyes were calculating now, weighing risks. 3 seconds, Lena said. Then I'm getting on a horse and riding to town. 1, 2. This ain't over, Wyatt snarled, but he was already pulling his horse around. The others followed. They rode off at a gallop, and Lena let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Then she heard the sound behind her. Caleb had dropped the rifle. He was on his knees, hands over his ears, rocking slightly. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his breathing ragged. No, 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 he was muttering. Can't let them take it. Have to stop them. Have to set. Caleb, Lena knelt beside him, kept her voice calm. They're gone. We're safe. You're here. You're on your ranch. You're safe. But he wasn't hearing her. He was somewhere else, seeing something else. His whole body was shaking now, trapped in whatever memory had seized him. Lena did the only thing she could think of. She started humming, an old lullaby her mother had sung to her, low and steady, a thread of sound to anchor him. She hummed while the sun climbed higher, hummed while his breathing slowly evened out. Hummed until the terrible distance in his eyes began to recede and she could see him fighting his way back. When he finally surfaced, gasping like a drowning man breaking water, she was still there. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm sorry, I can't. Stop, she said gently. You don't have to apologize. You stood up when it mattered. That's what counts. I broke, he whispered. Soon as they were gone, I broke. No, Lena said firmly. You bent. There's a difference. Breaking means you can't come back from it. Bending means you can straighten out again. She helped him to his feet, guided him back to the cabin, made him sit by the fire while she heated water for tea. Her hands were shaking too, she realized. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she'd let on. When she brought him the tea, he wrapped his hands around the cup like it was the only solid thing in the world. They're going to come back, he said. Hayes won't let this go. And next time they might not just threaten. I know. You should leave. Get out before— I'm not leaving, Lena cut him off. We've been through this. I'm staying. We'll figure it out. How? The desperation in his voice was raw. How do we fight a man who owns the bank, who can buy the law if he wants? I can't even get through a confrontation without falling apart. What good am I? Lena set down her own cup and reached across the table, taking his hand. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "Listen to me," she said. "You're not broken. You're not useless. You're a man who's been through hell and came out the other side. That takes more strength than most people will ever know. And as for fighting Hayes, we do it the same way we've been fixing this ranch. One piece at a time, one day at a time. And if that's not enough, then we'll deal with that when it comes." She squeezed his hand. "But I'm not giving up on this place, and I'm not giving up on you, so you're going to have to get used to that." For the first time since the riders had left, something like hope flickered in his expression. "You're stubborn," he said. "Damn right I am." That night they sat up late, talking through their options. The tax situation was real. Caleb admitted he hadn't paid in over a year, had barely been keeping track of time, let alone bills. But between what the town council was paying Lena and what little money Caleb had left, they might be able to scrape together enough to clear the debt. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Lena said. "Talk to the tax office, find out exactly what we owe. Then we'll figure out how to pay it. What if it's too much? Then we'll sell something, or borrow, or work extra. We'll find a way." Caleb shook his head, but he was almost smiling. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" "Not in my nature," she replied. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, they fell into comfortable silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and something neither of them wanted to name yet, it felt almost safe, almost like a home. Lena rode into Abilene the next morning under a sky heavy with the promise of snow. The cold bit through her coat, but she kept her shoulders straight and her chin up. She'd faced down 3 armed men yesterday. A conversation with a tax clerk wouldn't break her. The tax office was a cramped room above the land registry, smelling of paper and dust. The clerk, a nervous man named Porter with ink-stained fingers, pulled out the records without meeting her eyes. "It's bad, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, laying out the documents. 2 years unpaid plus penalties. Comes to $347. Lena felt the number like a physical blow. She and Caleb together had maybe $60 between them. "Is there any way to negotiate the penalties?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Porter shook his head. "I'm sorry, the amount is what it is, and ma'am," he lowered his voice. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Mr. Hayes has been asking about this property specifically. Says he wants to be notified the moment it goes to auction. When would that be?" "End of January, if the debt isn't cleared by then." 6 weeks. They had 6 weeks to find nearly $300. Lena thanked Porter and stepped back out into the cold. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, watching people hurry past, everyone focused on their own survival, their own struggles. The weight of impossibility pressed down on her shoulders. Then she straightened them again. Impossible just meant it hadn't been done yet. She spent the rest of the day making rounds. She talked to Thomas Webb at the general store, to Deputy Marshal Pritchard, to a few of the women she did laundry for. By the time she headed back to the ranch, the sun was setting and snow had started to fall, but she had the beginnings of a plan. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she arrived, and the relief on his face when he saw her made something in her chest tighten. "I was starting to worry," he said, taking the horse's reins. "I'm fine. Just took longer than expected." Inside, over a dinner of beans and cornbread, she laid it out for him. "We owe $347. We have about 60. That leaves almost 300 to find in 6 weeks. She watched his face fall, watched hope drain away. "It's too much," he said quietly. "We can't—" "Let me finish," she interrupted. "Thomas Webb says he'll buy cattle from us if we can round up what's left of your herd. Won't pay top dollar, but it's something. I can take in extra laundry and mending from town. And Deputy Pritchard said he'd talk to some of the other ranchers, see if anyone needs short-term work we could do." "That still won't be enough." "Maybe not," Lena admitted. "But it's a start. And I've got one more idea, but you're not going to like it." Caleb looked at her warily. "What?" "Your father's horses. You said he had good bloodlines. If there are any records left, anything showing the lineage, we might be able to sell those papers to other breeders. It won't be horse money, but it's something." She watched him wrestle with it. Those records were the last tangible piece of his father's legacy, the proof of years of careful breeding and selection. "All right," he said finally. If they're still readable. Most of the papers were in the barn office. I haven't looked at them since before. The next morning they searched the barn together, sifting through years of accumulated debris and decay. The office was a small room at the back, its door swollen shut from moisture. It took both of them to force it open. Inside was chaos. Mice had nested in what looked like old feed sacks. Water damage had turned whole stacks of paper into pulp. But in a metal box shoved under the desk, they found what they were looking for: breeding records, bloodline charts, documentation going back 3 generations, water-stained and mouse-chewed in places, but mostly legible. Caleb held the papers with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "He kept everything," he whispered. "Every birth, every lineage, every sale. It's all here." Lena gave him space, busying herself with sorting through what else might be salvageable. But she could hear the rough breathing, could sense the weight of memory pressing down on him. "He would have wanted you to use them," she said gently, "to save the ranch. That's what he would have wanted." "I know." Caleb carefully placed the papers back in the box. "Doesn't make it easier." They carried the box back to the cabin and spent the afternoon going through everything, determining what might have value. Some of the bloodlines traced back to horses that had won recognition at regional shows, others connected to breeding programs still operating in neighboring states. "This might actually work," Lena said, making notes. "I'll take these to the Breeders' Association in Wichita. It's a 2-day ride, but if we can get even $50 for the lot, that's $50 we didn't have." "I should go with you." "You need to stay here and round up the cattle. We can't risk Hayes sending his men back while we're both gone." Caleb didn't like it, but he couldn't argue with the logic. The next week was a blur of brutal work. Caleb spent his days tracking down the scattered remnants of what had once been a substantial herd. Most of the cattle had gone wild, unused to human contact. It took patience and persistence to bring them back, 1 or 2 at a time. By week's end, he'd managed to gather 11 head, including one ornery bull that nearly gored him twice. Lena, meanwhile, had ridden to Wichita. She came back 3 days later, exhausted but triumphant, with $75 sewn into the lining of her coat. "They fought me on every page," she told Caleb that night, warming her hands by the fire. "But there was one buyer who remembered your father's stock. Said he'd been trying to trace a particular bloodline for years and your records filled in the gaps. Paid premium for them." Caleb closed his eyes. $75. Plus the 30 Thomas will give us for the cattle. That's 105. With what we have, we're up to about 165. Still nearly 200 short, but it was progress. December deepened into real winter. The snow that had been threatening finally came in earnest, a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left drifts as high as the fence posts. They were trapped inside together, the cabin becoming their entire world. On the second day, cabin fever started to set in. The space that had seemed comfortable suddenly felt cramped, the silence oppressive. Caleb was pacing again, that restless energy that meant the walls were closing in. "Tell me something," Lena said from her seat by the fire, trying to break the tension. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He stopped pacing, looked at her. "Why?" "Because we're stuck in here together and I'm tired of my own thoughts. Tell me something real." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then he sat down across from her. "I didn't want to go to war," he said. "Everyone thought I was eager, patriotic, couldn't wait to prove myself. But the truth is, I was terrified. I tried to tell my father, tried to say I didn't want to go, but he said it was my duty. Said real men didn't run from their obligations. So you went." "So I went." His voice was hollow. "And everything I was afraid would happen, happened. Men died screaming. Boys I'd known my whole life blown apart by shells or cut down by disease. We did things—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "We did things I can't take back. Things that made us as bad as what we were fighting." Lena didn't say anything, just listened. "When I came back and my father asked me about it, asked if I was proud of my service, I couldn't answer. Because the truth is, I'm not proud. I'm ashamed. Ashamed I went, ashamed I survived when others didn't, ashamed of what I became over there." "You did what you had to do to survive," Lena said. "Did I?" He looked at her, his eyes dark. Or did I just do terrible things because everyone else was doing terrible things, and it was easier than being the one who said no? I don't know, Lena said honestly. I wasn't there, but I know that shame without action is just poison. If you're ashamed of who you were, be someone different now. What if I don't know how? Then you learn, one day at a time, one choice at a time. On the third day, the storm broke. They dug themselves out into a world transformed, everything white and clean and new. The sun on the snow was blinding, beautiful in a harsh way. They worked together to clear paths, check on the animals, make sure nothing had been damaged. The chickens had survived, huddled together for warmth. The cattle had found shelter in the lee of the barn. Even the wild mustang that occasionally appeared at the edge of the property, a ghost Caleb said had been hanging around for months, had weathered the storm. That night, as they sat exhausted by the fire, Lena brought up the subject they'd been avoiding. We're still short, she said. Even if I take in every piece of laundry in 3 counties and you sell every cow we have, we're going to come up short. I know. So what do we do? Caleb stared into the flames. There might be one thing, but you're really not going to like it. Tell me anyway. There's a winter horse auction in Dodge City, first week of January. If I could catch that Mustang, break him enough to show he's trainable, he might fetch $100, maybe more if the right buyer is there. Lena felt her stomach drop. Caleb, that horse is wild. You saw what happened to Jacob Miller's son when he tried to get near him, and you can't. She stopped herself. Can't what? Can't handle it? His voice had an edge. Can't be trusted not to fall apart? That's not what I meant, isn't it? He stood up, started pacing. You think I don't know what I am? I'm broken, Lena. I'm barely holding it together on good days. The idea of trying to break a wild horse, of having to be strong and steady and in control, yeah, I know it's asking the impossible. Then why suggest it? He turned to face her. Because it's all we have left, and because maybe if I can do this one thing, this one hard thing, maybe I can start believing I'm not completely useless. Lena stood too, cross to him. You're not useless. You've never been useless. Then let me try, he said. Let me do this. If I fail, we're no worse off than we are now. But if I succeed, if you succeed, you might get killed trying. I've been dying slowly for 4 years, he said quietly. At least this way I'd be doing something that matters. She wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but the truth was there wasn't one. They'd exhausted every option. This was their last chance. All right, she said finally, but we do it smart. We take our time, and if at any point it's too much, we stop. Deal? Deal. The Mustang was a gray stallion, scarred and suspicious, with eyes that held the same wildness Lena sometimes saw in Caleb. He grazed at the edges of the property, never coming too close, but never straying too far either, like he was testing the boundaries of trust. Caleb started the way he'd started with Silver all those years ago. He just sat. Every morning after chores, he'd walk out to where the Mustang grazed and sit on the frozen ground, 20 feet away. Not moving, not speaking, just being. The horse would watch him, ears forward, ready to bolt. But as the days passed, the distance between them slowly shrank. 15 feet, 10, 5. Lena watched from the cabin, her heart in her throat every time Caleb approached the animal. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the focus required to stay calm, to keep his own demons at bay while he worked with a creature that embodied wildness and fear. On the 5th day, the Mustang took grain from Caleb's outstretched hand. On the 7th, he let Caleb touch his neck. By the end of the 2nd week, Caleb had a rope on him. He's ready for the next step, Caleb told Lena that night. His hands were steady, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Tomorrow, I'll try the saddle blanket. And if he panics? Then we start over. He looked at her. This is the hard part. Everything up to now has been trust. What comes next is control. Making him accept something he doesn't want to accept. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Lena stood by the corral fence, watching as Caleb approached the Mustang with the saddle blanket folded over his arm. The horse's ears went back, his muscles tensing. Caleb started talking to him, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used when the nightmares were bad and he needed to talk himself back to reality. He let the horse smell the blanket, investigate it. Then, slowly, he draped it over the Mustang's back. The horse exploded. He bucked and twisted, trying to throw off the unfamiliar weight. Caleb held the lead rope, talking continuously, keeping just enough tension to remind the horse he wasn't alone, but not enough to feel like restraint. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the Mustang stood still, sides heaving, the blanket still on his back. "Good," Caleb murmured. "That's good. You're all right. You're okay." Lena realized she'd been holding her breath. Over the next week, Caleb built on that foundation. The blanket became familiar. Then came the saddle itself. Another explosion, another battle, another hard-won acceptance. Then the bridle. Each step was a negotiation between fear and trust, wildness and training. And each step took something out of Caleb. Lena could see it in the way he moved at the end of the day, like every muscle hurt. In the way he'd sit by the fire and stare at nothing, lost in whatever memories the work had stirred up. But he didn't break. He bent, but he didn't break. It was 3 days after Christmas when everything changed. The day had been going well. Caleb had successfully ridden the Mustang around the corral twice, the horse responding to basic commands, showing the kind of potential that might actually fetch good money at auction. Lena was in the cabin preparing dinner when she heard it. A sound like thunder, but wrong. Too sharp, too violent. Then screaming, not human, but close enough to freeze her blood. She ran outside to see chaos. The wild Mustang had broken through the corral fence, panicked by something Lena couldn't see. He was bleeding from a gash on his shoulder, eyes rolling white with terror. And he was running straight for the cabin, straight for her, caught in a blind panic that made him dangerous as a loaded gun. Behind him, Caleb was on the ground, thrown or fallen, his face white as bone. Lena should have run, should have gotten out of the way. But she stood frozen, watching this terrified animal bearing down on her, and all she could think was that if she moved, if she ran into the cabin, the horse would follow and destroy everything they'd built. Then Caleb was there. She didn't see him get up, didn't see him move. One moment he was on the ground, the next he was between her and the horse, his arms spread wide, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Whoa! Whoa! Boy! Easy!" The Mustang tried to swerve, but there was nowhere to go. He reared up, hooves flashing, and Lena heard herself scream. But Caleb didn't flinch. He stood his ground, still talking, still holding that space between terror and calm. "Easy. You're all right. Nothing here's going to hurt you. Easy now." The horse came down, snorting and trembling. Blood ran down his shoulder. His eyes were wild, but he was listening now, focused on the human voice instead of whatever phantom had spooked him. Caleb took a step forward. "That's it. You know me. You trust me. Nothing here but us. Nothing here but quiet." Another step. The Mustang's ears flicked forward. Caleb was close enough to touch now. He raised one hand, slow and steady, and placed it on the horse's neck. The Mustang flinched but didn't bolt. "There you go," Caleb murmured. "There you go. Let's get that looked at. Get you cleaned up." He took the trailing lead rope and started walking the horse toward the barn, his hand never leaving the animal's neck, his voice never stopping that low, steady stream of reassurance. Lena stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering, trying to process what had just happened. Caleb had been on the ground, lost in whatever private hell the fall had triggered. She'd seen it in his face, that terrible absence. But somehow, when it mattered, he'd come back. He'd stood between her and danger and hadn't broken. She followed them to the barn on shaking legs. Inside, Caleb was already examining the wound by lamplight. It looked worse than it was, a deep scratch from the broken fence, but not life-threatening. Lena fetched water and clean rags without being asked, and together they cleaned and bandaged it. The Mustang stood quiet through it all, like the panic had burned itself out and left only exhaustion. When they were done, Caleb led the horse to a stall and made sure he had water and feed. Then he just stood there, one hand on the stall door, his whole body trembling. "Caleb," Lena said softly. He turned to her and she saw tears on his face. "I thought he was going to kill you. he said, his voice breaking. I was on the ground and I couldn't move, couldn't think, and all I could see was you standing there and him running, and I thought... He stopped, struggling for breath. Lena crossed to him, put her hands on his face. But he didn't. You stopped him. You saved me. I was so scared, he whispered. I'm still scared. My heart's still racing, and I can't make it stop, and I keep seeing... I know, she said. I know you're scared, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs doing despite it. He pulled her close then, buried his face in her shoulder, and let himself shake. Let himself be afraid and human and alive. They stood like that for a long time, two people holding each other up in the darkness of a barn, while a wounded horse watched with quiet eyes. When they finally made it back to the cabin, night had fully fallen. Lena made tea, neither of them drank. They sat by the fire, closer than usual, not quite touching, but aware of every breath, every movement. I don't think I can do the auction, Caleb said finally. I know. Not because I'm afraid of failing, but because that horse trusted me today. When he was hurt and scared, he let me help him, and selling him feels like betraying that. So we find another way, Lena said. There is no other way. We're out of time. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what if I sold my mother's ring? Caleb's head snapped up. No, absolutely not. It's just a thing, Caleb, and it might be worth... It's not just a thing. It's your mother's legacy. You told me she made you promise to keep it, to pass it down. I also promised myself I'd survive, Lena said. And right now, surviving means keeping this ranch, keeping you in it. That matters more than a piece of metal and stone. Lena, we'll do it tomorrow, she said firmly. I'll take it to the jeweler in Abilene, see what he'll offer. It's settled. But it wasn't settled. Not for Caleb. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the fight between accepting help and holding on to the last shreds of his pride. Why? He asked finally. Why are you willing to give up something that precious for this? For me? Lena looked at him, really looked at him. This broken, beautiful man who'd stood between her and death today without hesitation. Because you matter, she said simply. Because this place matters. Because what we're building here, whatever it is, it matters more than what was. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers still trembling slightly, but his grip was sure. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not, she agreed, and despite everything, he almost smiled. They sat like that through the night, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers, knowing that tomorrow would bring new fights, new struggles. But tonight, for this moment, they had each other. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. Morning came too soon, gray and cold. Lena woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window with that distant look that meant he'd barely slept. She didn't ask about the nightmares. By now she knew they came whether he slept or not. I'm going with you, he said without turning around. To town? You're not selling that ring alone. If you're doing this for me, for us, then I'm standing beside you when you do it. Lena started to argue, then stopped. The set of his shoulders told her this wasn't negotiable, and truthfully, she didn't want to face it alone either. They hitched the wagon in silence and set out as the sun was breaking over the frozen plains. The ride into Abilene took 2 hours, neither of them speaking much, both lost in their own thoughts. Lena kept touching the ring through her coat pocket, feeling the familiar shape of it, the weight of her mother's memory. The town was busy despite the cold, people rushing about their business, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Lena guided the wagon toward the jeweler's shop on Main Street, her heart getting heavier with each turn of the wheels. Then she saw them. 3 horses tied outside the bank. One of them was Wyatt's distinctive roan. They're here, Caleb said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward where a rifle would be if they'd brought one. Keep driving, Lena said. We're not here for them. But as they passed the bank, Wyatt emerged with Carson Hayes himself, a thin man in an expensive suit, his face sharp as a hatchet. They saw Lena and Caleb immediately. Hayes said something to Wyatt, who grinned and called out, "Well, if it ain't the happy couple." Come to pay your taxes, Rourke. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, but he kept the wagon moving. Didn't think so, Wyatt continued, louder now, drawing attention from passers-by. You got what, 3 weeks left? Then that land's going on the auction block, and my boss here's going to buy it for pennies. Hayes put a restraining hand on Wyatt's shoulder, his own expression smoothly professional. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Whitaker. If you're having difficulty with the tax situation, I'd be happy to discuss a loan. Very reasonable terms. We don't need your charity, Caleb said, his voice tight. Not charity. Business. Hayes smiled without warmth. Think about it. The offer stands. Lena pulled Caleb away before he could respond, guiding the wagon to the jeweler's and climbing down with shaking hands. She could feel eyes on them now, the whole town watching, waiting to see if the mad cowboy and his widow woman would finally fail. Inside the shop, Mr. Brennan, the jeweler, was a kind-faced man in his 60s who'd known Lena's mother. When Lena pulled out the ring, his expression went soft. Your mother's engagement ring, he said, turning it over in the light. She showed it to me once, said your father saved for 6 months to buy it. I know, Lena said. Can you tell me what it's worth? Brennan examined it carefully, using his loupe, checking the stone, the setting. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sad. It's a good piece. The stone's small but well cut. The band's solid gold. I could give you $80 for it. Lena felt the number like a blow. $80? Combined with everything else they'd scraped together, it still wouldn't be enough. They'd still be $40 or $50 short. I'll take it, she said, her voice hollow. Lena, Caleb said quietly. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. She turned to Brennan. Can you have the money ready this afternoon? We need to... The shop door crashed open. Deputy Marshal Pritchard stood there, breathing hard like he'd been running. Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Rourke, you need to come with me. Right now. What's wrong? Lena asked. It's your ranch. Someone just wrote in saying there's smoke coming from that direction. A lot of smoke. The world tilted. They ran for the wagon, Pritchard swinging up beside them. Caleb drove like a man possessed, pushing the horse harder than he should, the wagon bouncing over ruts and stones. Behind them, other riders followed. Thomas Webb, some of the ranch hands from neighboring properties, even Father Morrison. But Lena knew, even before they crested the last rise and saw the black smoke billowing into the gray sky, that they were too late. The barn was burning. Not the cabin, thank whatever mercies existed, but the barn, the structure Caleb's father had spent 2 summers building, was engulfed in flames. The heat was visible from 100 yards away, the roar audible even over the pounding of hooves. Caleb brought the wagon to a skidding stop and jumped down, starting toward the inferno. Lena grabbed his arm. The animals, he said, his voice breaking. The Mustangs in there, the cattle. You can't go in there, she said, even as her own heart was screaming the same desperate need to save what could be saved. But Thomas Webb and 2 other men were already moving, wet cloths over their faces, running for the barn doors. They got them open, and cattle came streaming out, panicked and wild. 6, 7, 8 of them. Then the men were backing away, the heat too intense to go further. The horse, Caleb shouted. The Mustang's in the back stall. It's too far, Thomas yelled back. The whole back section's already gone. Caleb pulled free from Lena's grip and ran toward the barn. She screamed his name, but he didn't stop, didn't even slow. He grabbed one of the wet cloths, wrapped it around his face, and disappeared into the smoke. Lena tried to follow, but Pritchard caught her, held her back even as she fought him. Time stretched into something elastic and terrible. Seconds became hours. The barn groaned and shifted, timbers cracking, the roof beginning to sag. Then 2 shapes emerged from the smoke. Caleb, barely visible, leading the gray Mustang. The horse was wild-eyed with terror but following, trusting the human voice even through panic. They cleared the barn doors just as a section of roof collapsed behind them with a sound like thunder. Caleb fell to his knees in the snow, coughing, the wet cloth falling away to reveal a face blackened with soot. The Mustang stood over him, trembling, a dark burn across his hindquarters, but alive. Lena ran to them, dropping down beside Caleb. His eyes were streaming, his breathing ragged. But when he looked at her, there was something almost like triumph in his expression. Got him, he managed. Got him out. You could have died, you stupid, stupid man, she said. And she was crying now, couldn't stop. Had to try, he said. Couldn't let him burn. Behind them, the barn continued its collapse, timbers falling inward, the structure that had stood for 30 years reduced to ash and memory in less than an hour. Pritchard was already organizing a bucket brigade to keep the fire from spreading, though there was little enough left to save. Others were rounding up the scattered cattle, checking them for injuries. Father Morrison appeared with blankets and water, but Lena's attention was on the smoke itself, on the wrongness of it all. This wasn't an accident, she said. Pritchard looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? The weather's been cold and wet. We haven't had a fire in the barn for weeks. Nothing to heat, no reason. And look. She pointed to the pattern of the burn. It started in 3 places at once, there, and there. The deputy marshal followed her gesture, his expression darkening. You're right. This was set. Hayes, Caleb said, his voice raw from smoke and rage. Hayes did this. We don't know that, Pritchard said, but his tone suggested he suspected the same thing. Who else? Caleb struggled to his feet, Lena rising with him. He wants the land. We wouldn't sell, so he burns us out, makes sure we can't pay the taxes, and picks up the property for nothing at auction. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Rourke. You got any proof? I don't need proof. I know. The law needs proof, Pritchard said firmly. And until we have it, you need to stay calm and not do anything that'll land you in jail. You hear me? Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but Lena put a hand on his arm. He's right, she said quietly. We do this the right way, or we lose everything. The fire burned itself out over the next few hours. By sunset, all that remained of the barn was a skeleton of blackened beams and a pile of ash that glowed red when the wind stirred it. The cattle had survived. The Mustang had survived. Even most of the chickens had made it through unharmed. But the structure itself was gone, and with it any hope of making it through the winter with the livestock intact. Thomas Webb pulled Lena aside as the crowd was dispersing. I can't buy the cattle now, he said, his face apologetic. Not with nowhere to shelter them. They'll lose weight, maybe die before spring. I'm sorry, Lena. She nodded, too numb to respond. People offered help as they left. Some blankets, some food, promises of prayers and sympathy. But no one offered money. No one could afford to. These were hard times for everyone. When the last of them had gone, Lena and Caleb stood together in the yard looking at the ruins. The sun was setting, painting everything red and gold, beautiful and terrible. We're finished, Caleb said flatly. Even if we sell the ring, even if we sell every cow, every chicken, everything we own, we can't make up what we've lost. Hayes wins. Lena wanted to argue, to find some thread of hope to hold on to, but she was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of trying, tired of watching everything they'd built get torn down. Maybe you're right, she said. He looked at her, surprised. You're giving up? I don't know what else to do. She sat down on the porch step, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. We've tried everything, worked ourselves to the bone. And for what? So some banker can steal what isn't his? Caleb sat beside her. They watched the last light fade from the sky, the stars beginning to appear, cold and distant. I'm sorry, he said eventually. If I'd been different, been stronger, maybe we could have saved it. Don't, Lena said. This isn't on you. It's on Hayes and men like him who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want. They sat in silence for a while. Then Lena felt Caleb shift beside her. There is one thing we haven't tried, he said. What's that? Fighting back. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Hayes thinks he can terrorize us into leaving. What if we don't leave? What if we make it clear that we're not going anywhere, no matter what he does? Caleb, he burned down our barn. What's next? The cabin? What if someone gets hurt? Then we make sure the whole town knows it was him. We tell everyone what he's doing. We make it so public, so loud that he can't hide behind his respectability anymore. Lena turned to look at him. In the gathering darkness, his face was just a shadow, but she could hear the determination in his voice. You really think that'll work? She asked. I think it's all we have left. She thought about it, about standing up in front of the whole town and calling out Carson Hayes for what he was, about the risk, the possible consequences, about what happened to people who challenged the powerful. Then she thought about her mother's ring, sitting in her pocket, waiting to be sold, about this ranch that had become home, about the man beside her who'd run into a burning building to save a horse. "All right," she said, "let's fight." The next morning they rode into town together, not sneaking, not hiding, but riding straight down Main Street with their heads held high. Word had already spread about the fire, probably Wyatt making sure everyone knew the mad cowboy's place was cursed. They tied up outside the church and walked in to find Father Morrison preparing for the weekly service. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Rourke," he said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you today." "We need to talk to people," Lena said. "All of them. We need to tell them what's really happening." The priest hesitated. "That's a serious thing you're contemplating." "It's a serious situation," Caleb replied. Morrison studied them both, then nodded slowly. "The service starts in an hour. I'll make sure you have time to speak." The church filled up quickly. It always did when there was drama to witness. Lena saw Carson Hayes arrive with his wife, looking prosperous and pious. Saw Wyatt slip in at the back, smirking. Saw Thomas Webb and Deputy Pritchard, the women she did laundry for, the men Caleb's father had done business with. When Father Morrison called them forward, Lena's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. But she stood, and Caleb stood with her, and they walked to the front of the church together. The congregation went silent. Lena spoke first, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger. "Most of you know me. I've lived in this town my whole life. You know I'm not given to drama or exaggeration. So when I tell you that someone deliberately burned down our barn yesterday, I'm telling you the truth." A murmur ran through the crowd. Hayes's face remained impassive. "The fire started in 3 places at once," she continued, "on a cold, wet day when there was no reason for a fire to start at all. This wasn't an accident. This was arson. And I believe it was done to drive us off our land so that land can be bought cheap at auction." "That's a damned lie," Wyatt called from the back. "Is it?" Lena turned to face him. "You and your friends have been to our property 3 times in the past month, threatening us, telling us to leave. And now, just weeks before the tax deadline, our barn mysteriously burns down. You want to explain that coincidence?" "I don't have to explain nothing to you," Wyatt snarled. "Maybe not to me," Caleb said, speaking for the first time. His voice was rough but steady. "But you might want to explain it to the law, because Deputy Pritchard here is investigating this as arson, and when he finds proof, and he will find proof, whoever's responsible is going to hang." Hayes stood up, his face flushed. "This is outrageous. I've done nothing but try to help these people. I even offered them a loan." "At what interest rate?" Thomas Webb called out. 20%? 30? High enough to guarantee they'd default so you could take the land anyway?" "I resent these implications," Hayes said, his voice shaking with anger, or maybe fear. "I'm a respected member of this community. I've done nothing wrong." "Then you won't mind if the deputy searches your property," Lena said. "Looks for kerosene cans, maybe. Checks if any of your hands have alibis for yesterday afternoon." The church erupted in conversation, everyone talking at once. Hayes was protesting, Wyatt was swearing, and Father Morrison was calling for order. Through it all, Lena and Caleb stood their ground. Finally, Pritchard stood up. "I'll investigate," he said loudly, silencing the room. "I'll talk to everyone who was in town yesterday, find out who went where and when. And if I find evidence of arson, I'll prosecute. That's a promise." Hayes's face was white now. "You can't seriously believe—" "I believe I'm going to do my job," Pritchard said. "And you're going to cooperate fully. Understood?" The banker sat down, his wife clutching his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. Lena and Caleb returned to their seats as Father Morrison tried to restore some order to the service. But the damage was done. The seed was planted. By tomorrow, everyone in 3 counties would know that Carson Hayes was accused of arson. After the service, people approached them in the yard. Some offered support, others looked skeptical. But Thomas Webb pulled them aside with news. "I talked to some of the other merchants," he said. "We're putting together a fund, nothing huge, but enough to help you buy materials to rebuild. And I'll still buy those cattle if you can keep them alive through winter." "Thomas," Lena's voice broke. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It's not enough to save the ranch, but it might give you a fighting chance. Over the next week, something unexpected happened. The town rallied. Not everyone, and not enthusiastically, but enough. A group of men came out to the ranch and helped Caleb build a temporary shelter for the cattle. Rough, but serviceable. Women brought food and supplies. Someone donated lumber for repairs. And Deputy Pritchard kept his word. He investigated thoroughly, questioning everyone, checking alibis. He didn't find proof that would stand up in court, but he found enough to make Hayes nervous. Found out that Wyatt and 2 other men had been seen riding toward the Rourke Ranch the afternoon of the fire. Found kerosene-soaked rags in a gully half a mile from the property. Hayes tried to dismiss it, claimed his hands had been burning brush on his own land, had no idea how the rags got where they were. But the whispers started. The doubts. The questions about what kind of man would burn another man's livelihood. And while he'd never face charges, never see the inside of a jail cell, something more damaging happened. He lost his reputation. People started pulling their money from his bank, started taking their business to the bank in the next town over. His wife stopped being invited to social functions. His name became associated with shame instead of success. Caleb watched it all with something like grim satisfaction. "He's getting what he deserves," he said one evening as they worked on reinforcing the temporary cattle shelter. "Is he?" Lena asked. "He's losing his reputation, but we're still losing the ranch." It was true. Despite the town's help, despite everything they'd done, they were still short. The deadline was 2 weeks away and they were still $100 from what they needed. "We could take Hayes's loan," Caleb said reluctantly. "No," Lena said firmly. "That's exactly what he wants. To own us another way." "Then what?" Lena looked at the gray Mustang, healing from his burns, grazing peacefully despite everything. An idea was forming, dangerous and desperate. "The auction," she said, "in Dodge City. It's this weekend." "Lena, we decided not to sell him. But what if we don't sell him? What if we just show him, prove he's trainable, worth something, and then offer him for stud service instead? Rich breeders would pay good money for access to a horse with his bloodline and spirit." Caleb looked at the Mustang, then at her. "That's actually not a bad idea." "It's a terrible idea," she corrected. "It means taking him to a crowded, noisy place where anything could spook him. It means trusting that he'll behave, that you can handle him if he doesn't. It means risking everything on one last gamble." "So pretty much what we've been doing all along," Caleb said, and despite everything, he smiled. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Caleb worked with the Mustang constantly, getting him used to crowds by having the men who'd helped with the shelter stand around while he worked the horse, getting him comfortable with noise by banging pots and pans, making sudden sounds. The horse spooked sometimes, but always came back to Caleb's voice, Caleb's presence. On Friday morning, they loaded the Mustang into a borrowed trailer and set out for Dodge City. It was a full day's ride, and they camped overnight in the cold, taking turns watching the horse, making sure he stayed calm. The auction was held in a massive barn, warm with the press of bodies, horses and humans both. The smell was overwhelming, the noise constant. Lena watched Caleb's face go pale, saw his hands start to shake. This environment, crowded and chaotic and loud, was exactly the kind that sent him spiraling. "We can leave," she said quietly. "We don't have to do this." He shook his head. "I'm not running anymore." They waited their turn, the Mustang growing increasingly agitated as the sounds and smells worked on his nerves. Caleb kept one hand on his neck, kept talking to him. That low, constant stream of reassurance. When their number was called, they led the horse into the ring. The crowd was skeptical at first. This scarred gray beast with burn marks on his hindquarters didn't look like much. But then Caleb started working him. He showed the basics first: walk, trot, stop, turn. Simple commands the horse executed perfectly. Then he did something unexpected. He dropped the lead rope entirely. The Mustang stood there, free to run if he wanted. Caleb turned his back on the horse and walked to the center of the ring, stood there, vulnerable, trusting. The horse followed him. The crowd murmured, impressed despite themselves. Caleb called out commands and the horse obeyed, not out of fear or force, but out of trust. The bond between them was visible, undeniable. When they finished, there was actual applause. 3 different breeders approached them afterward, None wanted to buy the horse outright. He was too wild, too uncertain, but all three were interested in stud rights. They negotiated right there, and by the time they left Dodge City, Lena had contracts in hand worth $150, money they'd receive over the next year as the Mustang serviced mares. It wasn't immediate cash, but it was something better. It was future income, proof that the ranch could sustain itself. They rode home through the darkness, both exhausted but something like hope flickering in their chests. When they reached Abilene 2 days later, they went straight to the tax office. Porter looked up in surprise as they entered, then his expression went sympathetic. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry, but the deadline is still 5 days away," Lena said, placing contracts and cash on his desk. "This is $210 in immediate payment, and these contracts guarantee another $150 over the next year, which I'm asking you to accept as collateral against the remaining balance." Porter looked at the documents, his eyes widening. You actually did it. You raised the money." "Most of it," Caleb said. "Can you work with us on the rest?" The clerk studied the paperwork for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I think I can. Let me talk to the county assessor. But yes, I believe we can arrange terms that will satisfy the debt and let you keep the property." Outside, in the cold January air, Lena and Caleb stood on the wooden sidewalk and just breathed. "We did it," Lena said, the reality of it only now sinking in. "You did it," Caleb corrected. "You saved the ranch. Saved me." She turned to face him. "We saved each other." He pulled her close then, right there on Main Street where anyone could see, and held her like she was the only solid thing in a spinning world. And maybe she was. Maybe they both were, holding each other up when everything else wanted to drag them down. They stayed like that for a long moment, then headed back to the ranch, to the burned barn they'd rebuild, to the cattle they'd keep alive through winter, to the gray Mustang who'd become more than just a horse, but a symbol of something wild and wounded that could still be trusted, still be loved, to home. The winter that followed was brutal, but they weathered it together. The temporary shelter held against storms that would have flattened lesser construction. The cattle survived on hay they'd managed to buy with the immediate cash from the breeding contracts. And slowly, week by week, the ranch began to breathe again. February brought a thaw, brief but welcome. Caleb and Lena used the break in the weather to start clearing the barn site, salvaging what could be salvaged from the ashes. It was hard work, made harder by the memories each charred beam carried. But Caleb worked steadily, and Lena noticed something changing in him. He still had bad days, still woke sometimes with terror in his eyes, still flinched at sudden sounds. But the episodes were shorter now, less consuming. He'd learned to pull himself back faster, to use the tools Lena had quietly taught him, breathing, grounding himself in the present, focusing on something solid and real. One morning, as they were sorting through a pile of half-burned tools, Caleb straightened suddenly and looked at her. "I want to rebuild it," he said. "The barn? Not like it was. Better, stronger. I want to build something that lasts." He gestured at the cleared space. "My father built the first one to prove something. I want to build this one because it matters, because we need it, because I can." Lena set down the tool she was holding. "That's going to take money we don't have yet." "I know, but the breeding contracts start paying out in spring. And Thomas said he'd extend credit for materials if we need it. We could start small, build as we can afford to. Do it right this time." She studied his face, saw the determination there. This wasn't the broken man she'd found 4 months ago. This was someone fighting his way back to life. "Then let's do it," she said. They spent the next week drawing up plans, arguing over details, figuring out what they could manage themselves and what they'd need help with. Caleb had picked up more from his father than he'd realized. He knew how to frame a structure, how to make it sound, and Lena had her carpenter father's teaching to draw on. It became their winter project. On days when the weather permitted, they worked on the foundation, digging post holes, setting stones. On days when snow or ice kept them inside, they refined the plans, made lists, prepared. It was during one of those indoor days, with sleet hammering the windows and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Caleb finally told her about the war. Not all of it. Maybe he'd never be able to tell all of it, but enough. We were in the jungle for 3 months before we saw real combat, he said, staring into the flames. 3 months of heat and insects and disease, men dying from fever, from infected cuts, from water that made you sick just looking at it. By the time we actually faced the enemy, we were already half dead. Lena didn't interrupt, just listened. The fighting, when it came, wasn't like anything I'd imagined. It wasn't glorious or noble. It was chaos, men screaming, bodies torn apart, and the smell— He stopped, swallowed hard. The smell of death is something you never forget. You don't have to tell me this, Lena said gently. I think I do, he replied. I think I need to say it out loud to someone who won't judge me for it, someone who'll just hear it. So she listened as he told her about the boy from Abilene who died in his arms, choking on his own blood. About the village they'd burned because they'd been told it harbored enemy fighters, even though all they'd found were old people and children. About the moment he'd stopped feeling anything at all, when numbness became the only way to survive. When I came back, he said, everyone wanted to know if I was a hero, if I'd done brave things. And I didn't know how to tell them that I wasn't brave. I was just too broken to care if I lived or died. That's not courage. That's just emptiness. But you did care, Lena said. Eventually. You cared enough to keep going, even when it would have been easier to give up. Only because of you. She shook her head. I just gave you a reason to try. The strength was already there. You just needed to remember how to use it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm still afraid, Lena. Every day. Afraid I'll break again. Afraid I'll hurt someone. Afraid I'll lose everything we've built. I know, she said. I'm afraid too. Afraid the money won't come through. Afraid Hayes will find another way to destroy us. Afraid I'll wake up one day and realize this was all too good to be true. So what do? We be afraid together, she said simply, and we build anyway. March arrived with mud and the first hints of green. The breeding contracts started paying out, the money arriving in installments that let them buy materials for the new barn. Word spread about what they were doing, and people started showing up to help. Thomas Webb came with his sons, knowing more about carpentry than he'd let on. Some of the ranch hands from neighboring properties showed up on their days off. Even Deputy Pritchard spent a Saturday hauling lumber. The new barn rose slowly, built with care and attention that the first one probably hadn't needed. Every beam was measured twice, every joint fitted perfectly. Caleb worked with a focus that bordered on obsessive, checking and rechecking everything. It doesn't have to be perfect, Lena told him one evening as he was adjusting a support post for the third time. Yes, it does, he said, because if I build it right, it'll stand for 50 years, 100. It'll be here long after we're gone, proof that we didn't give up, that we made something that mattered. She understood then that this was about more than just shelter for animals. This was about legacy, about reclaiming what the war had taken from him, the belief that he could create instead of destroy. The barn was halfway finished when Carson Hayes left town. It happened quietly, without announcement. One day his house stood empty, his belongings gone, his wife already relocated to her sister's place in Kansas City. The bank he'd owned was taken over by a larger institution from Wichita, and the new managers made it clear they had no interest in land speculation or questionable loans. Wyatt and his friends disappeared too, drifting to wherever men like that drifted when their patrons' money dried up. Lena felt no triumph at the news, just a quiet relief. The threat was gone. They could build without looking over their shoulders. April brought warmth and rain, and with it, the land came alive. The garden Lena had cleared the previous fall accepted seeds eagerly, and green shoots began pushing through the dark soil. The cattle, lean from winter but alive, started putting on weight as grass returned to the pastures. Even the chickens seemed to sense the change, laying more eggs than Lena knew what to do with. And the gray Mustang, fully healed from his burns, became something of a local legend. The mares brought to him produced foals with his spirit and intelligence, and word spread. More breeding contracts came in, worth more money, enough to finish the barn and start thinking about other improvements. It was on a warm evening in late April, with the barn nearly complete and the ranch transformed from ruin to something approaching prosperity, that Caleb made his proposal. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over land that was finally truly theirs. The gray Mustang grazed nearby, no longer wild but never quite tame, content in the space between. "I've been thinking," Caleb said. "That's usually dangerous," Lena replied, but she was smiling. "This ranch, everything we've built, it should have a future, a real one. It does. We have the breeding program, the cattle are healthy, the garden's producing. That's not what I mean." He turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I mean, it should have a future beyond just survival. It should have permanence." "Caleb, let me finish." He took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. "When you came here, I was already dead. I was just too stubborn to stop breathing. You gave me a reason to live, Lena. You showed me that broken things can be fixed, that broken people can find their way back, and I don't want to face another day without knowing you'll be here beside me." Lena felt tears prickling her eyes. "I know I'm not much," he continued. "I'm still scared most days. I still have nightmares. I'll probably never be completely whole. But I'm better with you than without you, and I hope, maybe you feel the same way." "I do," she said softly. "Then marry me," he said, "not because it's proper or expected, but because I love you, because you're the strongest person I've ever known, and I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of that strength." For a moment, Lena couldn't speak. Then she laughed, a sound that was half sob, half joy. "You're asking me to marry a man who still can't get through a thunderstorm without shaking, who jumps at shadows and probably always will?" "I am." "You're asking me to tie myself to a ranch that nearly killed us both to save, that still needs years of work to be what it should be?" "Yes." "You're asking me to believe in a future that's anything but certain." "I'm asking you to believe in us," he said simply, "in what we've already survived, what we've already built." Lena looked at him, this man who'd been written off as mad, as broken beyond repair. Looked at the ranch they'd saved together, the barn they'd built, the life they'd carved out of ruin and refusal. Looked at the gray Mustang, that wild thing that had learned to trust. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her close then, and they sat together as the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in the darkest place and chosen light. They married on a Sunday in May, in the same church where Lena had stood and accused Carson Hayes of arson. The ceremony was simple, attended by the people who'd helped them survive. Thomas Webb and his family, Deputy Pritchard, Father Morrison, the women who'd brought food, and the men who'd raised barn walls. Caleb wore his father's good suit, cleaned and mended. Lena wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Thomas had given her at cost. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate celebrations, just two people making promises to each other and meaning them. "I can't promise I won't stumble," Caleb said when it came time for his vows. "Can't promise I won't have bad days, or that the past won't come back to haunt me sometimes. But I can promise I'll keep trying. I'll keep fighting to be better, to be present, to be the man you deserve." "I don't need you to be perfect," Lena replied. "I just need you to be honest, to share the burden when it's too heavy to carry alone, to remember that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every time you do." They exchanged simple gold bands, not expensive, but solid. Real. And when Father Morrison pronounced them married, the kiss they shared was gentle, tentative, the start of something neither of them had expected to find. The reception was held at the ranch under the frame of the nearly completed barn. Thomas had brought his fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and there was music and laughter, and a sense of celebration that the land itself seemed to share. Even the gray Mustang wandered close, drawn by the unusual sounds, unafraid. As evening fell and the guests began to drift away, Caleb and Lena stood together looking at everything they'd built. The new barn, strong and true. The repaired fences. The garden bursting with life. The cattle grazing peacefully. The cabin that had gone from a place of decay to a home. "I want to do something," Caleb said suddenly. "What?" "Come with me." He led her to a cleared patch of land on the south side of the cabin, a spot that caught good sun and had rich soil. From the barn he retrieved a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 6 young apple trees, their roots carefully wrapped. "I bought these from a nursery in Wichita," he said, "with the last of the breeding money. It's probably foolish, probably impractical. They won't bear fruit for years, and there's no guarantee they'll even survive. But they're a promise," Lena finished. "A promise that we'll be here to see them grow." "Yes." They planted them together as the last light faded, 6 trees in careful rows. When they were done, their hands dirty and their backs aching, they stood and looked at what they'd made. "You know what this means," Lena said. "What?" "It means we have to stick around, have to be here to see the first apples, have to make sure these trees grow strong and healthy." "I can live with that," Caleb said, and he was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made them bright. Summer brought growth to everything. The apple trees put out new leaves, reaching toward the sun. The garden produced more than they could eat, so they started selling surplus in town. The barn was finished, grand and solid, with room for twice as many animals as they currently had. And the breeding program continued to bring in steady money, enough to start thinking about luxuries. A new stove for Lena, better tools for Caleb, maybe even a proper horse or two to add to the herd. But more than physical prosperity, something else was growing. Trust. Partnership. Love that went deeper than attraction or convenience, rooted in shared struggle and mutual respect. Caleb still had nightmares, but now when he woke, gasping in the dark, Lena was there to hold him until the terror passed. She still worried about money, about whether they could sustain what they'd built, but Caleb was there to remind her of how far they'd come, how much they'd already survived. They learned each other's rhythms, learned when to push and when to let be, learned that some days just required getting through to the other side, and that was okay. On a hot afternoon in July, they were working in the garden together when they heard horses approaching. Lena felt a moment of old fear. Hayes might be gone, but threats could come from anywhere. But the rider who appeared wasn't threatening. He was a weathered man in his 50s, sitting a good horse with the ease of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. He pulled up at the edge of the property and called out, "This the Rourke place?" "It is," Caleb replied, moving to intercept while Lena stayed back. Old instincts died hard. The man dismounted, extending a hand. "Name's Patterson. I own a ranch about 30 miles east. Been hearing things about a gray Mustang you got here, and about the man who broke him." "I didn't break him," Caleb said. "I just convinced him we could work together." Patterson smiled. "That's exactly what I heard. Also heard you survived the war in the Philippines. Came back different, but didn't let it beat you." Caleb tensed. "What's this about?" "I got a nephew," Patterson said. "Good kid. Went off to fight same as you did. Came back, not right. Doesn't talk much. Doesn't work. Mostly just sits and stares. His parents don't know what to do with him. And I thought maybe, if you had time, you might talk to him. Show him it's possible to find a way back." Caleb looked at Lena. She nodded slightly, giving permission he didn't really need but appreciated having. "I'm not a doctor," Caleb said. "I'm not even sure I'm fixed myself." "Don't need a doctor," Patterson replied. "Just need someone who understands, someone who's been there and came out the other side." "All right," Caleb said slowly. "Bring him by. I'll talk to him. No promises, but I'll try." Patterson's relief was visible. "That's all I'm asking. Thank you." After he left, Lena came to stand beside Caleb. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know, but maybe I should. Maybe if I can help someone else the way you helped me, it'll mean something, make sense of what I went through." The nephew, a young man named David, came the following week. He was thin, hollow-eyed, silent. Lena served them coffee on the porch and then made herself scarce, giving them space. She didn't hear what they talked about, and Caleb didn't share it. But David stayed for 3 hours, and when he left, there was something different in his face. Not healed, but maybe slightly less lost. He came back the next week, and the week after that. By the 4th visit, he was helping with chores. By the 6th, he smiled at something Caleb said. Other families heard about it. More young men came, some from the war, others from different hells. Caleb worked with them all, never preaching, never promising cures, just showing them that life after trauma was possible. That broken didn't mean finished. The ranch became something more than just a ranch. It became a place of healing, of second chances. And in helping others find their way back, Caleb found something he'd been looking for without knowing it: purpose beyond survival. Autumn came with gold and red leaves, with cool nights and warm days. The first breeding money of the new season arrived, more than last year. The cattle were healthy and numerous. The apple trees, though still too young to fruit, were thriving. The barn stood strong against early storms. And on a crisp October morning, Lena stood in the garden harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when Caleb came running from the barn, excitement in his face. "The gray had a visitor this morning," he said, slightly out of breath. "Another breeding contract?" "No." He grabbed her hand, pulled her toward the south pasture. "Look." At first she didn't see it. Then movement caught her eye, and she gasped. A foal, barely hours old, standing on wobbly legs beside a mare Lena didn't recognize. But the foal's coat was gray, and its eyes held a familiar wildness. "The Mustang's first foal," Caleb said, "from that breeder in Kansas. He sent word the mare was close, asked if I wanted to be here for the birth. I rode out before dawn. Watched the whole thing." He was grinning like a boy. All traces of the haunted man he'd been gone in this moment of pure joy. "He's beautiful," Lena breathed. "She," Caleb corrected, "a filly, strong and healthy, damn near perfect." They stood watching the foal explore her new world, stumbling and recovering, fearless in her newness. And Lena thought about how much had changed in a year, how they'd gone from ruin to this, to life, to growth, to futures that stretched beyond just getting through today. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The new barn sheltered animals comfortably. They had food stored, money saved, plans made. And they had each other, tested and proven through fire and loss and survival. On Christmas Eve, Caleb and Lena walked out to the apple trees, now dormant but alive, waiting for spring. Snow covered the ground, making everything clean and quiet. "Next year," Caleb said, "we should plant more, make a real orchard." "Next year," Lena agreed, "and maybe the year after that we'll see the first apples. And the year after that we'll have enough to make cider, maybe even sell some. And after that we keep going," he finished. "We keep building, keep growing, keep fighting for this place and each other." Lena took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the gentle certainty. "I used to think broken meant finished," she said quietly, "that once something was destroyed, it could never be whole again. But this place taught me different. Taught me that broken just means there's work to be done, that the mending makes it stronger, not weaker." "You taught me that," Caleb said. "You and your stubborn refusal to give up, your belief that I was worth saving even when I didn't believe it myself." "We saved each other," Lena corrected. "That's what love does. Holds you up when you can't stand alone. Reminds you who you are when you forget. Gives you a reason to keep going when every other reason fails." They stood together in the snow, looking at 6 small trees that held the promise of decades yet to come. Looking at the ranch that had nearly destroyed them and instead became the foundation of everything they'd built. Looking at each other, 2 people who'd found home in the most unlikely place, in each other's broken pieces. Years would pass. The apple trees would grow tall and bear fruit, sweet and abundant. The ranch would prosper, becoming known throughout the territory for its horses and its healing. More young men would come seeking what Caleb had found, a way to live with their demons, to build lives despite them. David would eventually take over his uncle's ranch, strong and capable, crediting Caleb with saving his life. The gray Mustang would sire dozens of foals, his bloodline spreading across 3 states. And the barn Caleb built would stand for 100 years, just as he'd promised, outlasting them both. But none of that mattered as much as this moment, standing in the snow beside 6 young trees, hand in hand with the person who'd become everything: home, partner, purpose, love. "You know what I'm most afraid of now?" Caleb asked suddenly. "What?" "That I'll wake up one day and realize this was all a dream, that none of it was real." Lena squeezed his hand. "It's real. The trees are real. The ranch is real. I'm real. And so is this, what we've built together." "Promise me something," he said. "Anything." Promise me we'll see the first apples, that we'll be here together when these trees finally bear fruit. I promise, she said. We'll be here. For the first apples and the 100th, for every harvest and every spring, for every storm and every sunrise. Even on the bad days? His voice was quiet, vulnerable. Especially on the bad days, she replied firmly. Because that's when promises matter most. When things are hard and you want to give up, and you need someone to remind you why you keep going. I'll be that someone for you, and you'll be that someone for me. He pulled her close, and they stood together as snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the world in new white. The ranch was quiet except for the sound of their breathing, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nicker of horses settling in for the night. Out on that stretch of land beyond Abilene, in a place that had once held only death and decay, life had taken root. Not perfect life, not life without struggle or pain or fear, but real life, hard-won and precious, built by two people who'd refused to let darkness win. The mad cowboy wasn't mad anymore. He was just a man, scarred and healing, learning to live in a world that had tried to break him. And the widow wasn't alone anymore. She was a partner, a wife, a force that had turned ruin into home through sheer determination and stubborn love. Together they walked back to the cabin as night fell completely, to warmth and light and whatever tomorrow would bring. And for the first time in either of their lives, tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise.